Hey guys, so in this video I wanted to discuss progressive overload and the nuances of it and what most people don't understand about progressive overload. Because I feel like many people inherently do understand, they hear the concept of progressive overload and it basically says over time you need to be getting stronger, adding volume to the bar in order to see, muscle and strength gains and positive adaptations in the gym. While that is true, that's an oversimplified definition of a rather nuanced concept. So to first off discuss this, progressive overload is basically the ability of the body to adapt to previous training stimulus to be able to beat prior performance. And this is important at the same relative effort level. So what that means is that if you have gone from an RPE 8 to RPE 9, that is overloading your system, but that is not necessarily progressive overload. You have not had the same adaptation in time, because if you did RPE 8 last week, but then you added 10 pounds to the bar and it's RPE 9, that's not necessarily progressive overload, right? So what that means is that your body's adaptive ability is going to be dependent upon a few things. So your training age, how big and strong you are, which is going to be correlated to your training age, and what type of adaptations you're trying to see, and because there's a little bit different ways of programming. So let's just dive into, for example, if I have a beginner lifter, they're basically able to progress loads on the bar at the same relative effort week to week. That's how I would define a beginner lifter in terms of a time scale. If we're talking about strength gains and muscle gains as a metric, as volume is increasing, we can therefore infer, since volume is the primary driver of hypertrophy, as long as you're training within the hypertrophy quote-unquote rep range, you'll be able to see the adaptations. Intermediates typically will progress on a bi-weekly basis, so it'll take them about 2 weeks just to have, they're able to add 5 pounds to their squat, and in 2 weeks at this, and over time that was RPE 8 in week 1. It takes them 2 weeks for them to have like the same RPE at a higher weight progressively. Whereas advanced typically need to, it takes about a month for those adaptations to actually happen. So when you are designing a training program and when you are creating expectations and designing how you will overload progressively over time, you need to take that into consideration, in my opinion, first and foremost. How long have you been training, and because that's going to determine to a large extent how fast your body can actually overload and adapt. So for example, that's why if I have a beginner lifter, I'm going to structure their RPEs, their low progressions differently than in intermediate or an advanced lifter. One of my favorite ways of programming for beginners is simple linear progression. So I want them to be able to, let's say, add 5 pounds every single week, or we can add a greater load and lower reps. Basically, that's going to be more or less a more suitable progression scheme for a beginner lifter. Now, if I'm doing an intermediate lifter, having more of an alternating periodization, which would basically be more of an undulation in intensity. So let's say, I want them to have a top set at RPE 9 on bench press 1 week, and then the next week I want them to have an RPE 8, so they'll have a little bit lower stress with higher volumes, get that working, still support the adaptation from that harder, that bigger disruption to their physiology. It's going to take a longer time for them to recover and adapt. They're bigger and stronger. And then the next week I can say, okay, I want you to do RPE 9 again, but do 5 pounds more. And I'm assuming that because they're intermediates, by that time they'll be able to adapt on that point. Whereas an advanced lifter who can usually only see results month to month, in terms of load on the bar being expressed, because like I want to make it very, very clear, adaptations are still happening over this time. The limiting factor in the gym is that sometimes the adaptations are so small that they aren't like able to be expressed on either load progression or a rep progression on the barbell. But for like an advanced lifter, I will usually have, you know, an absolute progressive overload structure month to month, because it takes that long for them to actually adapt, because they're just more adapted to the stimulus. They have more adaptive resistance, they're bigger, they're stronger. For every single overload, it takes more of their recovery resources. You have to remember there's a certain supply and demand here as well with progressive overload. So when you are in the gym, this is the principle of SRA, because this is stimulus recovery adaptation, and this ties into progressive overload, the concept of it, just so fundamentally, because beginners can, you know, lower stimuluses relative to their body, you know, capacity, because, you know, I don't care if you're doing a 3x5, like even though that is quote unquote on paper like the same set and rep scheme. If you're having a beginner lifter do a 3x5 with 100 pounds on their bench press, whereas an advanced lifter doing a 3x5 with, you know, 400 pounds on their bench press, the 400 pounds bench press is going to have a much larger disruption, a much larger stimulus. Therefore, the recovery curve and the adaptation to that is going to take more time. So while you are imposing that stimulus, you are then triggering the recovery and adaptive responses. And since the body has a limited capacity to recover and adapt over a training block progressively, you need to structure your programming in a way that is designed around that. That's why I also ask in my programs, in my questionnaires, when I'm designing a training block for a client, I ask them what's their life stress like, what is their schedule, right? Like right now, what's it going to be throughout the training block, so that I can design a training cycle that'll be able to allow them to actually achieve progressive overload based off of lifestyle circumstances. So if someone's more stressed out, that is going to affect training. Stress is stress. So any sort of stress to the system is going to impact your body's ability to recover and adapt to and from that training that you have just done. So the biggest takeaway here is that you cannot force progressive overload. Now you can try to beat yourself down, and especially in overreaching block, you know, there are times when, you know, you will have to still have that stimulus in order to facilitate that adaptive response, and overload still does need to be occurred, but they need to be managed through light sessions, through a moderate sessions, through an organization of the training week, of the training blocks, so that you can actually set yourself up for success and you're not just beating yourself into the curb every single time. For example, when I do an intermediate progression, you know, I'm going to have to alternate more between, you know, moderate and low days, and use high days more sparingly in terms of high stress, you know, high overload, and, you know, intersperse that with the progressive overload with, you know, lower stress, lower stimulus sessions, so then that adaptation can actually be seen and achieved when I want it to, without the lifter losing fitness or the ability, you know, the strength, the muscle that they have basically developed up to that point, and can help, you know, further along the adaptation. So understand that your training should have a logical structure of hard, light, moderate sessions, in order for to have adaptations take place and for progressive overload to actually be progressive in nature. If you are trying to still overload as an intermediate lifter the same way as a beginner lifter, you're not going to make much progress. And this is why I don't recommend lots of cookie cutter programs, because they are mainly made for beginner lifters, and they don't really take into account the individual, their lifestyle circumstance. Now they certainly can work, but they have to be modified, you know, to that individual. And typically beginner lifters don't know enough to actually like alter a program and intelligent manner beyond just like, I want to add an extra set of bicep curls because that's fun. But when you are designing a training block and you're having a low progression scheme, you're designing, this is what I'm going to do overload. You can have more predictability in your schedule of overload of training in order to actually make long-term meaningful progress based off of how your body's responding to training, your training age, your size, how disrupted you get by certain movements. And this is a skill. This is one of the art forms of coaching and programming, which is something that I feel like separates great coaches and great programmers from just guys that just like write random crap, is they don't understand how this actually works, how this applies with this, certain principles of, strength training, of hypertrophy, of specificity. Because, for example, you could do overload, but if you are not doing, like the main rep ranges and the main types of intensity that you are doing are going to determine what type of overload is progressive in that specific way. So, for example, if you want to get more hypertrophy, because we know hypertrophy is dependent upon volume, well, you should probably have, most of your reps work be, 6 to 20 reps, for example, and intersperse it across that and have your overloading sessions be, as such, so that you can actually have that overload be progressive with the muscular system and achieve more muscle gain and strength gain in the way that you want it to over time, predictably. Likewise, if you're trying to, improve peak power, you should have most of your volume be within the 1 to 3 rep range with higher percentages of your 1 rep max, and then intersperse light sessions, accordingly, and moderate sessions within those, rep ranges, so that you can actually have the most adaptive magnitude of that response towards every adaptation. And with strength, have more general strength work within like 3 to 6 rep ranges. So I know this was probably a pretty in-depth video, like holy crap, like this is a lot. But I want to get across here is you should set up your overload across your training sessions intelligently with an actual understanding of how progressive overload actually works. You cannot force it. If you're finding that over time you're not able to actually achieve progressive overload and you're constantly just feeling beat up all the time, it's probably just a shitty program, because training fatigue is something that happens regardless of how good your program is or not. So if you're like not making progress and you're beat to shit all the time, you just don't feel good, your program probably sucks. If you're like not making progress and you're trying to constantly force overload, like your program is not very good, because fatigue is something that happens with a logical program anyways, but you should still be seeing progress across the block. But because fatigue is accumulates linearly and fitness is not a linear thing, it's pretty slow comparatively. And there will become a point where you outpace it, and that's where you have deloads and you have active rest periods. But yeah, it's just an important part to understand about programming and actually analyzing your program design. So hopefully this video was helpful to you guys, it was enlightening, and made you think a little bit more in depth about this, instead of just like from one small scope of something that's just not talked about enough and just really misunderstood, because it's been like, just train harder than last time. That works great as a beginner, but there's going to be a point when you can't just train harder than last time. You have to train a little bit more intelligently, and train harder than last time when it makes sense to, and when your body actually can, instead of forcing it all the time. So anyways, please like the video, subscribe. If you guys want coaching or programs, AdamPeelerFitness.com, links down below, and then follow me on Instagram at AdamDPeeler, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.